Welcome to the America's Workforce Radio Podcast, the flagship production of the American Workers Radio and Podcast Network, where organized labor and its never-ending fight to protect the rights of the American worker come first. Now, presented by LiUNA, Laborers International Union of North America. Here's your host, Ed Flash Ferenc.
2023, a year of a whole lot of strikes, but now we know the numbers. Also, unfair labor practice charges, a 10% jump. And today on the show, the latest from the BlueGreen Alliance and the new rules on independent contracting. Welcome to the Friday, March 8th edition of America's Workforce, where we're available on at least 5 platforms, including Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, iHeartRadio, Spotify, and Pandora. We have 2 guests on the show today. We're going to start things off with Thomas Kay. Thomas is a program manager for energy transition at the BlueGreen Alliance. Great organization. They started years ago with the help of the steelworkers. BlueGreenAlliance.org. In fact, we had a recent conversation with their executive director, Jason Walsh. Well, Tom, again, as a program manager for energy transition, in that role, he coordinates the Alliance's federal advocacy efforts on economic recovery and infrastructure investments. And I'll tell you, there's been a lot from the Biden administration in the first 2 years. Tom has over a decade of experience working on federal advocacy campaigns. He was most recently the legislative director for Appalachian Voices. And he's going to talk about that. And that's where he focused on economic development in coal communities and coal waste pollution issues. So we're going to talk about what he does, the importance of green energy, the importance of that good legislation that has been coming out of the Biden-Harris administration, and the transition. You know, there's been a lot of pushback, and a lot of that pushback from union workers, especially in the fossil fuel industry. And we're going to talk about that because those are good-paying union jobs. That transition going to solar and wind, not necessarily the case there. So Tom will address that and a whole lot more. Our second guest on the show is Andrew Strom. Andrew, he's been on the show a number of times. He's been a union lawyer for more than 25 years now. He serves as Associate General Counsel of the Service Employees International Union, big union out of New York City, 32BJ. But he doesn't talk about that union. He is a blogger for a great publication from Harvard University's law school called On Labor. Just go to onlabor.org. You could find a wealth of information. A lot of good stories, labor law updates, it's all there. What we're going to talk about on the show today is a change here that's going to go into effect next week on independent contractors. The Department of Labor released a final rule. This was earlier in January, which would make it more challenging for companies to classify workers as independent contractors under the Fair Labor Standards Act. Now, the rule aims to crack down on the misclassification of employees as contractors, which has allowed companies to skirt their workers' rights to minimum wage and overtime pay. You know, a lot of that's going on right now. Now, while the rule does not single out any particular industry or job, it will likely have far-reaching impacts on construction, trucking, and healthcare industries where this happens a whole lot. The policy is also expected to disrupt business models like Uber and Lyft, which rely on hiring drivers as gig workers rather than employees. Now, this new rule, what it does, it replaces the independent contractor rule that was set forward by the Trump administration's Department of Labor back when he was president. And that established, well, you shouldn't be surprised by this, it pretty much established a business-friendly rule for examining independent contractor status. That rule focused on 2 core factors: the nature and degree of control over the work, and the worker's opportunity for profit or loss to drive the independent contractor analysis. Now, under the new rule, and Andrew's going to spell it out, there's 6 factors to be considered, and we're going to take a look at that. But right now, the way this looks, the framework is expected to tip the scales in favor of workers. Isn't that what we want? So Andrew Strom will be our second guest right here on America's Workforce. Now, a brief look into the world of labor. The segment brought to you by Boyd Watterson Asset Management. You can find more at boydwatterson.com. We know there was a lot of strikes last year. Now we have some data. The number of striking U.S. workers more than doubled, according to a new study. Nearly 540,000 workers walked off the job in 2023. The total number climbed 141%. 141%. Alexander Colvin is dean of Cornell University School of Industrial Labor Relations, and he said, this rise in strike action after many years of diminished activity indicates a union resurgence that is shifting the balance of power back toward labor. 4 large strikes accounted for more than half of the workers involved in work stoppages, pointing to multi-state campaigns among actors, auto workers, healthcare employees, as well as an action carried out by school staff in Los Angeles. SAG-AFTRA, which is my union, a union representing roughly 160,000 actors, went on strike for nearly 120 days, culminating in a 3-year contract that raised wages by around 14%. Then there's the UAW, union representing 150,000 employees at major car makers, ending a strike after a set of agreements that delivered roughly a 25% raise over a 4-year period. Then there's the 75,000 healthcare workers at Kaiser Permanente. The total number of work stoppages actually ticked up by 9% in 2023 compared to the previous year, primarily due to the sizable share of workers who took part in very large strikes. So over a 4-decade period beginning in the late 70s, wages, well, they pretty much flattened, increasing only about 0.2% a year when you throw in inflation to adjust it. And last year they said enough is enough. we need to do a whole lot better, and that's why we're going on strike. So we're going to do more on this in future shows from the researchers at Cornell. In the meantime, the National Labor Relations Board released data about the past year that provides more evidence of increasing union activity. Bloomberg News analyzed the board's reported case data and reports over 20,000 unfair labor practice charges were filed with the board in the past year. That is a 10% jump from the previous year and the highest number of cases since 2016. Altogether, workers filed nearly 2,600 union representation petitions, highest number since 2015. However, with its staffing level at the labor board, the board has not been able to keep pace with the rise in incoming cases. The chair of the board, Lauren McFerrin, said that additional resources are necessary to enable the board to expand staffing capacity and continue processing cases more efficiently, which is primarily why a number of conservatives want to pretty much eliminate the NLRB, because there's a whole lot of labor violations going on right now, and they don't want to hear about it. All right, we're going to take a quick break. When we come back, the latest from the BlueGreen Alliance. Don't go away.
This is America's Workforce. More shows available at awfradio.com.
It takes LiUNA to build North America's infrastructure. From roads and bridges to schools and skyscrapers, the men and women of LiUNA, the Laborers International Union of North America, build the projects we depend on. From constructing the Freedom Tower on the site of the former World Trade Center to untangling Washington, D.C.'s congested interstate, LiUNA members do the work that matters. Find out what it takes to be built by LiUNA at liuna.org. That's LiUNA.org.
America's Workforce appreciates our sponsor, the Columbus Central Ohio Building and Construction Trades Council, who represents more than 18,000 workers from 19 affiliated local unions and district councils.
Attention members of the Heat and Frost Insulators Union who are interested in traveling. Central Ohio has more construction projects on the books than anywhere in the U.S. Mega projects, large and medium-sized jobs are creating more work than our local 50 brothers and sisters can handle. Projects like Intel, the Honda LG battery plant, and multiple data centers for Facebook, Google, and Amazon offer union wages, overtime, and exciting incentives. Local 50 is seeking union travelers to meet the needs of its signatory contractors who can put you to work immediately. If you're a member in good standing and interested in the work opportunities in Central Ohio, visit insulators50.com/AWF travel for more information. America's Workforce is brought to you in part by the Ironworkers. You can find more at ironworkers.org.
America's Workforce is sponsored in part by Boyd Watterson Asset Management, LLC. Find out more about our investment solutions tailored to meet the needs of Taft-Hartley funds at boydwatterson.com.
America's Workforce is brought to you in part by the Communication Workers of America. You can find more at cwa-union.org.
This segment of America's Workforce is brought to you by Survey and Ballot Systems. SBS has been providing unions with secure and flexible election options for over 30 years. Visit surveyandballotsystems.com to learn more.
America's Workforce is brought to you in part by the United Steelworkers. You can find more at usw.org.
Now, back to Ed Flash Ferenc with America's Workforce.
And remember, you can check us out on Facebook or follow us on X, formerly known as Twitter. That would be AWF Union Podcast. By the way, this next segment brought to you in part by the Ohio Federation of Teachers. You can find more at oh.aft.org. Let's go to line number 2. Welcome to the show, Thom K. Thom is the program manager for energy transition at the BlueGreen Alliance. We just did a segment with Jason Walsh, who's the executive director of the BlueGreen Alliance. And today we're going to talk to Thom about what he's doing to coordinate the Alliance's federal advocacy efforts on the economic recovery and infrastructure investments. And we spent a lot of time with Jason on that. And I tell you, this is one thing I really love to talk about, how good policy can translate to good jobs. More importantly, good union jobs. And it's so important that we keep going in that direction. Thom K., welcome to America's Workforce. And if you don't mind, give me a little more background on how you became the program manager for energy transition. That had to be an interesting story. Can you share it with our listeners?
Yes, glad to. And thanks so much for having me on. So years ago, I headed up to D.C. Right after college, determined to make a difference in the world, and quickly ended up organizing magazines at a Books A Million. But I did eventually find my way into something more policy-related, thank goodness, and worked at a great organization called Appalachian Voices for 10 years, focused on the Appalachian region and coal mining issues and economic development. And through that work, got to know BlueGreen Alliance better. Worked with a few people who are over here, and worked also very closely with Appalachian communities who are dealing with economic transition. And the opportunity came for me to join BlueGreen Alliance and work largely on the recovery campaign we had, where we're trying to pass what ended up being Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and Inflation Reduction Act. So I was coordinating a lot of our work on that, and then it moved on to some implementation, and I was able to take a position as our program manager for energy transition. So we have a large coalition of 14 organizations, national labor and environmental groups, and they all care about the energy transition and have different ways of dealing with it. So I try to coordinate all of those parties together. So we have one shared vision, for federal policy, but also in a lot of states too. We work closely with a number of state governments that are going through major changes in the energy transition.
Well, transition is a key word, and for years, for decades, I mean, even longer than that, we were so dependent on fossil fuels, and we still are. It's still much the case, but there is this transition, and you know what? Let's focus on coal here, because you spent a lot of time, as you mentioned, these Appalachian Voices. I'm sure you heard a lot, and coal was their livelihood, and it also hurt them. When you think about black lung and all the other parts of coal that we're trying to put in our past here. We're still dealing with that, with with the effects of coal mining. So
Yeah.
where's this administration on coal right now, Thom?
Well, no administration has done more for coal communities than the Biden administration, and last Congress especially. So a lot of these coal communities are in different places throughout the country. That includes coal mining communities and power plant communities. And for some places, they've got a coal power plant that's going to be up and running for quite a few more years, whereas you also have towns, especially in eastern Kentucky, that relied on coal mining for a long time, but they haven't had a coal mine in 10 years. So this transition is in a different place for different people, and it'll continue going. One of the biggest issues we run into is when a coal plant closes, it can be devastating to the community. You don't just lose the jobs, which is key, and you lose economic activity that way, but you also lose tax revenue, and the local tax revenue is what keeps the town going. So a lot of small towns where you've got the mayor wears three hats and also runs the waste management, they're in a real tight place. So we've been working with communities for years and our partners to find ways to get funding into these communities and keep them whole and keep the workers whole. One of the first things we asked of this new administration was to create a national coordinating body, because there are a lot of federal agencies, a lot of them spread out across the country, that have a lot of resources and are engaged in coal communities, but they've not always been talking to each other. So one of the first things the Biden administration did was to create an interagency working group of 13 agencies focused on coal and power plant communities, so they could coordinate all of those efforts, which became even more important as the money began to flow. So when the Recovery Act that passed soon after sort of overlooked and all of that was $300 million for coal communities, and that was through the Department of Commerce. They ended up turning that into $500 million for economic development and workforce development, and trying to tie all of that together. Fortunately, after that, we got to work on the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, which had a piece that I've been passionate about for a long time, which is reclamation. One of the great things about reclamation jobs, if you're going to reclaim a coal mine, an old abandoned coal mine, you can't outsource that. You can't do it remotely. It's got to be in that coal community. So the jobs do go directly there. We've been working hard with Department of Interior and states to make sure that those reclamation jobs are good union jobs whenever possible. And then the other big piece, of course, is the Inflation Reduction Act, as you've talked about quite a bit on your show. One of the challenges, as I said, you lose all this tax revenue, but what do you do then? How do you draw in manufacturing jobs and new business? That's really difficult. Well, in the Inflation Reduction Act, there are bonuses for being in energy communities if you're going to produce or invest in clean energy. And then probably my favorite part is for advanced manufacturing. There's a carve out of $4 billion in tax credits just for coal communities. So companies can take advantage of those tax credits if they are going to build advanced manufacturing in coal communities. And right now, we're eagerly waiting for the announcements of the first round. The applications are all in, and so we'll see in the next month or so what that actually looks like for the first round. But that's going to leverage, $4 billion is going to leverage another $10 billion on top of that to drive investments into these communities that otherwise are often at a disadvantage for bringing in those kinds of investments. So really excited about that.
Well, what about cleaner coal? Because I know we've been going in that direction, and I know I guess some states are a little farther advanced than others on that. Coal mining states I'm talking about. Where's the administration on that? Because we, with the technology available today, we can still use coal in this country.
Yeah, well, a lot of it is right now, especially the coal that we mine, is used for metal making and used for steel. So much of it these days. We ship a lot of it out of the country too. There are ways to clean up a steel facility, make it more efficient, and also investing in carbon capture, which they're absolutely doing. That's another source of billions of dollars into carbon capture technology, which we're going to need not just for power plants as we usually think of it, but also for industrial facilities. A lot of facilities are going to have a very difficult time moving away from fossil fuels if they still want to heat something up to 2,000 degrees Celsius. That's pretty tough to do with solar. So carbon capture is going to play a big piece in that on the industrial side as well as the power plant side.
Okay, let's talk a bit about power plants, the utilities here. Now, what can they do in order to help their workers navigate through these plant closures? I would imagine they would have a role to play, and I guess there's an example here, the XL Workforce Transition Plan. Can you help me out on that? Yeah,
so utilities can do a lot, and they can do a lot more than they usually do. Too often, they're just not really held accountable, and one of the things that they frequently do is they don't tell everybody when they're going to close until they have to. They keep that until it becomes sort of a matter of urgency. And in some cases, they'll hold it and hope to get some subsidies to stay open for another year or so. All part of their plan, really, and don't always communicate well with the communities and their workers. So fortunately, in Colorado, not so fortunately, it took a lot of work. In Colorado, they passed legislation to really push utilities to provide a work plan and a transition plan. And that should happen, in my view, absolutely everywhere. Every large utility is fully capable of creating a workforce transition plan and working with the community and the workers on those details. What do you need out of this transition plan? It shouldn't just be something that they come up with on their own. So first of all is provide everyone with the most accurate dates you can. I've talked to quite a few people who are planning about a closure, and they're saying, okay, so it's going to close in 2030, and they haven't seen that the utility actually said it will close by the end of 2030. It ends up closing in 2027, and no one's gotten a chance to really plan for it because they weren't given the best information. But what you see with Excel, what they did with their workforce transition plan, is they provided a lot of data on the workforce itself and did a lot of what's called skills mapping, which is going to be essential for driving investment into these areas and helping those workers specifically get new jobs. So you've got a large workforce that's losing their jobs, but they're professionals. They've got years of experience and skills that can be applied to other things. But they need some help. Everybody needs some help with that. You can't expect each person to do their individual market analysis on what future jobs look like. But a utility can do that, and they can say, okay, here are the jobs, here are the types of things you all are trying to bring into this community, or jobs of the future that could be really good careers. Now, here's your skill set. We've mapped it out. We know exactly what it is because you work for us. And here are the skills required for that new job. Now, here's the gap. And then you've got something you can really focus on. You can work on gaining those skills and figuring out what it is that maybe if a company comes in, you can learn on the job, but they need to know specifically what do you need to learn. Utility has so much of that information, and workers often don't have that. You can't really just expect them to, and the community doesn't either. I'm talking to community economic development folks. They try to recruit companies in and say, look, we've got a great workforce, and we need a little bit more specificity than that. How many of those workers are getting a bridge to retirement, and how many are staying on to work?
Yeah, we gotta cast some light on them here, because you know there's a lot of people making good money in the fossil fuel energy industry right now, and I get it. I love what the BlueGreen Alliance is trying to do. Again, we're in a transition here, but that transition, it's a tough one. It's a real tough one, especially when people are making good money and it's a union job and they're worried, gee, well, where am I going to be in a year? Where am I going to be in 2 years? And I guess the best way to wrap up this conversation is we're making progress. I mean, what would your message be to that individual worker, Thom, who's in that industry that is kind of fading away a bit? What would that message be?
I say really two things. One is just an understanding that it is not easy at all. No one should treat it like it is. It's never going to be as simple as, okay, the coal plant shut down, now go get a job in solar industry. That's rising, right? It's never that easy. And we should recognize that. I've been unemployed in the past, and it was far more stressful than any job I've ever had. But the sooner you plan, the better. Plan for that future. Think about what skills you have, which are plenty of skills that can be applied to other things, and come up with a plan for how you're going to get there. If you wait until a plant closes or a mine closes or your facility closes, those options, they start to shrink really quickly. A lot of people just aren't able to make the best choice. The one that they know they want to make is, I would like to do a 2-year training program. That'll be right for me in the long run. But if you don't have time to plan for that option sometimes goes out the window because you've got to pay the bills immediately.
You got it.
That would be it. Just plan as much as you can, and work with your community if you can on what they're going to see next.
The only constant is there's change. I mean, that's pretty much it, and you have to plan for that change. Good answer there, Thom. Thom Kay, who is program manager for energy transition for the BlueGreen Alliance, website bluegreenalliance.org. Thom, great job. Keep in touch with us, okay, brother?
Happy to. Thanks so much.
All right, we're going to take a quick break. When we come back, labor lawyer Andrew Strom on the independent contractor rule.
You're listening to America's Workforce with Ed Flash Ferenc.
It takes LiUNA to power North America with affordable energy. The men and women of LiUNA, the Laborers International Union of North America, have the skills needed to build and maintain oil, natural gas, nuclear, solar, and wind projects that are shaping America's energy future. From new energy tech to retrofitted facilities, LiUNA members do it all. Find out what it takes to be powered by LiUNA at LiUNA.org. That's LiUNA.org.
The Iron Workers Great Lakes District Council, consisting of 8 iron worker local unions in West Virginia, Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Michigan. We build the skylines and bridges along the Great Lakes. With more work than ever before, the Great Lakes District Council is actively searching out the next great iron worker, whether it's building the next Intel plant or constructing a bridge to safely connect our great cities along the lake. So join the Iron Workers Great Lakes District Council today. Find out how and learn more about the council by visiting iwdistrictcouncil.com. America's Workforce is brought to you in part by the International Federation of Professional and Technical Engineers. You can find more at ifpte.org.
A great union requires a reliable election system. Survey and Ballot Systems is a trusted election partner with more than 30 years of expertise in managing union elections. By partnering with SBS, your union can ensure it gets an auditable process and a high level of customer service. SBS is here to help you conduct your union vote securely, transparently, and with trust building always in mind. Visit surveyandballotsystems.com to learn more.
This portion of the show is brought to you by Anthem Blue Cross and Blue Shield, Labor's trusted health partner, bringing people, communities, and care together to transform the future of health. For more information, please visit anthem.com/labor and trust. America's Workforce is brought to you in part by the International Brotherhood of Teamsters, where you can find more at teamster.org.
Now, back to America's Workforce. Here's Ed Flash Ferenc.
And remember, you can check us out on at least 5 platforms. That includes Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, iHeartRadio, Spotify, and Pandora. And when you get an opportunity, just sign up and receive our shows on a regular basis and give us a rating. We always appreciate those 5-star ratings. Well, this is a time to dissect labor law. And joining us on our live line today is Andrew Strom, who's been a union lawyer for more than 25 years. He's Associate General Counsel of the Service Employees International Union, Local 32BJ in New York City, but he's not speaking on their behalf. He is a contributing writer to the On Labor blog, which is a service of the Harvard Law School, and I talk about it on the show. There's a lot of good material there. And the main thing we're going to talk about today is the misclassification of workers and regulation. This is a new Department of Labor regulation regarding independent contractors. And I'll tell you, this is a subject that has been a pain in the butt for workers for a long time, and the NLRB. Andrew, I figured this is a good time to bring you to the table here because we got this recent regulation here that's causing a stir, let's be honest, but why don't you sort it out for our listeners? I'll let you pick it up from there, buddy. Go ahead.
Sure thing. I think that this is like so many things that the Biden administration does, which is to say undoing something, an anti-worker move by the Trump administration, but also something which is actually unfortunately going to have limited impact because the final word is going to be in the courts, and at least for the moment, the courts are still stacked with anti-worker judges who in many cases were appointed by Trump. So, but let's talk about the rule. So this new rule only applies to the Fair Labor Standards Act. And one of the things that's so messy and complicated about this whole misclassification issue in independent contractor versus employee is that there are different tests for different laws, and some of it is by federal law and some of it is by state law. And the Fair Labor Standards Act actually has the most favorable pro-worker language. The Fair Labor Standards Act, otherwise known as the AFL-CIO, defines an employee as anyone who an employer suffers or permits to work, and that's some archaic sounding language that comes from laws passed against child labor. And the idea is that it's supposed to go beyond sort of what's a traditional employer-employee relationship and say, if someone is doing work for your benefit, you have to treat them as an employee for purposes of the Fair Labor Standards Act, and you have to pay the minimum wage. You have to make sure that they get paid time and a half for overtime. And what the Trump administration did was the Trump administration tried to narrow that test and tried to replace sort of this traditional multi-factor test with a much narrower test that gave him, made it much hard, made it much easier for employers to misclassify workers. So, for example, they said, well, if the workers can select their own schedules, then they're not independent or then they're not employees, then they are independent contractors. And, it's not that hard to say to someone, you can select your own schedule. Like if you say, the office is open from 8 to 8, but you can come in any 8 hours that you want during that time. Most people wouldn't think that because your employer gave you some flexibility in terms of your hours, that meant that you're no longer an employee, but that you're, an independent contractor. And there was, and so, and they said, well, if you have if the worker invests in equipment, then you're an independent contractor rather than an employee. And you think about trucking, for example, where there was a case a few years ago involving Federal Express, where FedEx was saying was treating all of their short distance drivers as independent contractors. and saying, well, you have to buy a truck that matches our specifications, but you own the truck. Mm-hmm. And, and they said, oh, and you can use it, you can use it in your off hours, after you've finished your full-time job with us, if you want to use it for your own purposes, as long as you strip off all of the identifying, signage that we have. And so, even though as a practical matter, if you have one full-time job, most people don't even have time to try to figure out a second way, to use that truck during their off hours, right? They're just recovering from their full-time job.
Sure. There's no time left in the day.
So I think the real problem is that unless Congress acts here, it's always going to be a mess to figure out if somebody's an independent contractor or an employee, because what this worker-friendly rule that the Biden administration announced, it's still a 6-part test. And I can try to quickly walk through the 6 parts, but you could see that once you have a 6-factor test, where some factors are going to be one way and some factors are going to be the other way, the problem is that workers will never know in advance where they land on that test, right? And you can't say with certainty, I'm an employee or I'm an independent contractor. Let me try to quickly talk about the 6 factors.
Sure, go ahead.
The first test is whether through managerial skill there's an opportunity for profit or loss. And one of the things that has to do with is, can the worker negotiate their own prices? So, for example, if you're if the employer is saying this is the amount of money that you're getting, take it or leave it, the worker isn't really in a position to negotiate a different compensation. Or maybe if the worker, like in a true independent contractor relationship, the worker can hire somebody else to do the work. Right? You can have a helper do the work for you. But in most cases, where there's misclassification, that's not true. So that's the first factor. The second factor is the investment by the worker and the employer. Right? Is the worker really making an investment in equipment, and is the employer providing the equipment? The third one is the permanence of the relationship, right? The more permanent the relationship, the more likely that it's an employer-employee relationship. I mean, if you think of sort of the classic, at least in my mind, sort of the classic true independent contractor relationship, it's, you get a plumber to come to your house to fix, something in the sink, right? I mean, the plumber's coming once, right? The plumber isn't coming there, isn't showing up at your house every day. I mean, they may do a short project, but they're not, you're not having the plumber, every day for a year coming to your house. The next is the nature and the degree of control, how much the employer controls the aspects of the work, right? And for the Trump administration was trying to say, well, control has to mean that you basically tell the worker what to do. But that's never been the case. If you have a restaurant and you hire a cook or a chef at a restaurant, that person is your employee, even though, that cook or that chef gets to decide, how to prepare the recipes. They're not necessarily making, they have freedom to decide, what to put in the sauce,
Sure.
et cetera. And then the next one is whether the work is an integral part of the employer's business. right? And the more it's sort of the core of the business, the less likely that the person's an independent contractor. And then the sixth is the specialized skills. The more that the worker is bringing specialized skills to the job, maybe the less likely.
Andrew, if you don't mind, let me interrupt you here because I have to take a quick break here, and I want to run down those 6 factors that you talked about. Number 1, the worker's opportunity for profit or loss. Number 2, investments by the worker and the employer. Number 3, degree of permanence of the work relationship. Number 4, nature and degree of control. Number 5, extent to which the work is performed as an integral part of the employer's business. And lastly, number 6, specialized skill and initiative. Okay, this is all part of the Department of Labor's final rule, which would make it more challenging for companies to classify workers as independent contractors under the Fair Labor Standards Act. Now, what we're going to do next, after the break, we're going to talk about what California is doing. Andrew Strom joining us on our show today, America's Workforce, union lawyer for more than 25 years. We'll continue with him right after this.
This is America's Workforce.
It takes LiUNA to keep America running. Over 70,000 public employees are part of LiUNA, the Laborers International Union of North America, delivering critical services such as healthcare and emergency response, as well as maintaining roads and sanitation systems. Even the National Postal Mail Handlers Union, representing over 47,000 U.S. postal workers, is affiliated with LiUNA. Find out what it takes for LiUNA to keep America running at LiUNA.org. That's LiUNA.org.
Are you looking for a new healthcare partner for your union members? Let Anthem Blue Cross and Blue Shield be your champion, making sure your members live their healthiest lives. Now more than ever, it's important to have a partner you can trust, one who understands the unique challenges unions face. Anthem provides a variety of options to meet your organization's needs and helps you control costs without sacrificing quality of care. For more information, visit anthem.com/labor and trust. America's Workforce is brought to you in part by the United Auto Workers. Find more at uaw.org.
There is unity and strength for workers.
We are the USW.
We are the USW.
The United Steelworkers.
The largest industrial union in North America.
We represent 850,000 members in the U.S., Canada, and the Caribbean.
We work in metals,
rubber,
chemicals,
paper,
oil refining,
atomic energy, and the service sector.
We are steelworkers, standing strong and fighting for what's right.
America's Workforce is brought to you in part by the Heat and Frost Insulators Labor Management Cooperative Trust. Find out more at insulators.org/LMCT.
America's Workforce Radio is sponsored in part by the International Union of Painters and Allied Trades, District Council 6, representing painters, glazers, drywall finishers, and sign and display industry workers. They remind you that belonging to a union is your right as an American.
America's Workforce is presented by the Laborers International Union of North America. Feel the power right now at LiUNA.org.
Now, back to Ed Flash Ferenc with America's Workforce.
And remember, you can check us out on Facebook or follow us on X, formerly known as Twitter. That would be AWF Union Podcast, AWF Union Podcast. By the way, this next segment brought to you in part by the United Labor Agency, where you can find more at ulagency.org. Let's go back to our live line and rejoin Andrew Strom. And what we're doing on the show is dissecting labor law, primarily a decision from the Department of Labor. They released their final rule, which is supposed to go into effect. The date I have here is March 11th, which is going to be next week. And what we're talking about is classifying workers as independent contractors under the Fair Labor Standards Act. And this would make it more difficult for companies to classify those workers. So we talked about the 6 factors in the last segment. And I guess some states, well, they're a little bit different, primarily California. Talk to me about what they're doing, because it sounds like they've kind of simplified this process. Can you explain that part, Andrew?
Well, California and some other states use what's called an ABC test to determine whether someone's an independent contractor. And what that means is that a worker is an employee unless all three of these things are true. And the first is A, that they're free from any control or direction by the would-be employer. B, the work is outside the employer's usual business. And C, the worker is engaged in an independently established trade, occupation, or business. Right? So that's a much simpler test. And the idea is that, as I was saying before, if you bring in, an electrical contractor or a plumber to do a little bit of work at your workplace, they fit all three of those tests. But you can't say, you can't be FedEx and say, we're in the business of delivering merchandise, but the people who deliver that merchandise are independent contractors, not our employees. You can't be a trucking company and say we're in the trucking business, but the people who, operate those trucks are independent contractors, not our employees. And, again and again, you can't just say that something that, we're going to have people doing our core business or doing work inside our facility on a regular basis, but we're just going to label them as independent contractors. And you could see how this is a much simpler test in terms of enforcement, right? Because you don't have to get into this whole question of, well, there's 6 factors and 2 factors point one way and 4 factors point the other way, and do I just do math and add up the 2 and the 4, or does somehow these 2 factors, weigh more heavily than the other 4, or, what if, 3 factors are a close call and 3 factors, are not a close call, then, does that matter? Or, it's just, and you could see even the 6 factors that I talked about before, how there's always, some ambiguity, right? You have a group of workers and, some of them, let's say one of them takes advantage of, hiring, an assistant to do the work. And so does that make all of them independent contractors because one was able to somehow do that? Anyway. So this, I think, but the problem with this, of course, is that the only way you could get that for federal law is for Congress to act, and Congress isn't going to act on this or really anything else, as we've seen over and over again.
No, they haven't done anything on anything.
Right, exactly. So we're stuck with this, sort of murky multi-factor test. We're stuck with, but, let me just, end by saying how just important this issue is and why employers try to evade it, right? It's not just about paying, minimum wage and overtime. It's about not paying Social Security tax. That's an 8 or 9% savings. It's about not paying unemployment tax. For workers, it's about not getting covered by, anti-discrimination laws. It's about not being covered by OSHA. It's about not being covered by, all these other workplace protections that exist, on the federal, state, and local level. We don't really have protections in this country for independent contractors. So if an employer can, attach that label of independent contractor to you, then you really are outside the scope of almost every workplace protection that exists. And that's a pretty scary situation to be in for a worker.
Well, I can tell you the AFL-CIO is real happy with what the Department of Labor did. Got a comment here from Liz Schuler, the president of the Federation. She said, too many companies put profits over people, intentionally misclassifying their workers as contractors to avoid paying the pay, overtime, workplace rights, and benefits that employees are due under federal labor and employment laws. The proposed rule will ensure DOL has the tools to protect employees against the current and escalating problem of misclassification. Now, on the other side of the fence, and I always quote this woman because she is notoriously anti-union, Representative Virginia Foxx, Republican out of North Carolina, she said that the modern economy is rapidly changing and America's workforce, she's not talking about the show, America's workforce requires flexibility to thrive. The DOL's rule is the polar opposite of flexibility. The livelihoods of independent contractors, app-based workers, freelancers, and self-employed individuals will be completely destroyed.
Flexibility means the right to exploit workers.
Yeah. And getting screwed on wages. I mean, that's what it's all about. But you mentioned earlier, I guess the courts will have the last word on this, and that's the scary part of this. So, I mean, so a ruling could come down here, and then all of a sudden, bingo, the courts are involved. Is that what you see happening here, Andrew?
Well, I mean, what this rule does is this rule guides the Department of Labor's enforcement actions, right? So what it means is that the Department of Labor is going to rely on this rule for deciding which employers to sue for minimum wage and overtime violations. But then when those cases go to court, ultimately they're going to be decided by federal judges. Depending upon how interested the Supreme Court is, they may weigh in, but it may get decided, just by the judges below that level. But the judges, wherever it goes, the judges are going to get the last word about how to interpret this law.
And it's important to point out this rule only applies to the Fair Labor Standards Act, which is the law requiring employers pay minimum wage and overtime. And there's so many violations in that camp. And we're talking about people, they're not making that much. The federal minimum wage is still $7.25 an hour. Hasn't changed, I believe, since 2009. That's when it went up. And the Congress actually changed the law. I believe it was in 2007 and went into effect 2 years later. Now, many states have taken it upon themselves to raise a minimum wage, but not the federal government, not Congress. Going back to what we said, they haven't done anything. And they still probably are not going to do anything on this issue. But the bottom line is they're screwing over people that are not making a lot of money, just trying to make ends meet. That's what this is all about.
And I just say one more thing about this. I think that employers sometimes mislead workers into thinking that it's somehow in their interest to be an independent contractor, and it just isn't. There's no way in which it's in any worker's interest. I mean, the employers will say, well, you can't have flexibility if you're not an independent contractor, but nothing prevents an employer from giving its workers flexibility. I mean, nothing prevents an employer from saying to workers, you can pick your own schedule. You can take a day off if you want to. You can work from home if you want to. You can, any of those, so-called flexibility issues, they can give those rights to employees as well as independent contractors. There's no rule that says just because someone's your employee, you can't, give them a break. You can't let them, work, the hours that they want to work. So there really is no way in which workers are advantaged by being labeled independent contractors.
Well, we'll leave it on that note. Andrew Strom, contributing writer to the On Labor blog, onlabor.org. Go over there and you could check all the articles that he has posted there. Andrew, you take care, stay safe, strong, and we'll be doing more down the road. Okay, brother?
Thank you very much. It's good talking to you.
And that'll be it for another edition of America's Workforce. Coming up on Monday, the Association of Professional Flight Attendants. That and more. Until then, all of you have a safe and wonderful day.
That concludes another episode of the America's Workforce Radio Podcast. Thanks for listening, and be sure to subscribe so you never miss a show. America's Workforce is a production of Labor Tools and BMA Media Group. Find out more information online at labortools.com.